How would Joe Biden handle China as president? Would he be tough on the Chinese Communist Party? Or would there be a U.S.-China reset? Welcome to China Uncensored. I'm Chris Chappell. Over the past few years, standing up to China has become a bipartisan issue. Maybe one of the few bipartisan issues left in the United States. In general, everyone agrees what's happening in Hong Kong is not okay. Neither is what's happening to the Uyghur Muslims in Xinjiang. And of course, that whole coronavirus cover-up hasn't done wonders for the Chinese Communist Party's image. Nevertheless, despite a clear record of abuses by the Communist Party, there are still people in America who would like to see U.S.-China relations reset to what they were before the Trump administration. For example, Wall Street. Wall Street was not too happy that Trump wants to delist Chinese companies from the U.S. stock market, even though he's doing it because those companies aren't following U.S. laws. And then there's big tech companies like Apple. Apple is lobbying to change a bill aimed at stopping forced labor in China. And despite China being a high-risk place to invest, what with the currency manipulation, intellectual property theft, and state-run companies defaulting on bonds, the Communist Party is trying to woo foreign investors, and they're eating it up. So clearly, despite the fact that the Chinese Communist Party is an authoritarian regime that commits heinous human rights abuses and has been open about waging unrestricted warfare on the United States, some people think there's a lot of money to be made in China. So forget U.S. national security, let's reset the U.S. relationship with China. And that's led many to ponder, would Joe Biden go easy on China? Henry Kissinger is telling him he should. And that's kind of scary because Biden's perspective on Russia and China are almost entirely molded by the Kissinger doctrine of the U.S.-Russia-China triangle. Biden recently acknowledged that he regards China as a competitor only, whereas Russia is the most serious threat to the United States' global standing. Before the election, I did a full rundown on the differences between Trump and Biden's stance on China on this episode of America Uncovered. But now we know a bit more, since we have a better idea of who Biden is picking as his advisors. And I'll get to them in a moment after this commercial break. Welcome back. Would Joe Biden really try to reset U.S.-China relations to what they were before Trump? Well, as a U.S. Senator, Joe Biden supported China's entry into the World Trade Organization back in 2000. It might have seemed like a good idea at the time, but since then, China has broken every WTO rule on the book. So maybe Biden's views on China have changed as well. In Foreign Affairs magazine earlier this year, Biden wrote the U.S. does need to get tough on China. And he wants to use U.S. alliances to shape the rules of the road so that they can reflect democratic interests and values. But then there are takes like this from Axios. Trump plans last-minute China crackdown. The premise is, Trump will enact a series of hardline policies during his final 10 weeks to cement his legacy on China, to make it politically untenable for the Biden administration to change course as China acts aggressively from India to Hong Kong to Taiwan, and the pandemic triggers a second global wave of shutdowns. Which implies Biden wants to undo Trump's China policies. So will Biden try to take things back to where they were during the Obama administration? Chinese reports have acknowledged that back-channel contacts are going on with Biden's circle. China's decision to extend congratulations to Biden suggested that it wanted to send a signal to the president-elect to unfreeze the ties despite current setbacks. He Weiwen, a former senior Chinese trade official, said Biden would not care what kind of building blocks Trump has put for him. He could blow them down. Obviously, the Chinese Communist Party would prefer that. Then there's the concerns that Biden and his family may be compromised.
Evidence of the interests between the family of presidential candidate Joe Biden and the Chinese Communist Party continues to mount. On November the 18th, The Senate released a supplementary report on the investigation into the Biden family's ties to foreign business arrangements, further validating the accusations of shady financial dealings between the Biden family and the CCP, as well as Russia.
It's hard to say exactly what Biden himself is thinking when it comes to China. But right now, perhaps the best measure we have as to how a Biden administration would handle China is what his advisors say about it. Let's start with Jake Sullivan, Biden's pick for National Security Advisor. Sullivan was Vice President Biden's National Security Advisor. He was also a senior advisor to Hillary Clinton's 2016 campaign. In 2018, he was interviewed on CBS's Intelligence Matters podcast, and he said one of his successes was helping China rise.
We helped create the conditions of stability and security in East Asia that allowed China to have this remarkable economic rise, so that its rise in a way is not the failure of American foreign policy, it's the success of creating those stable conditions.
Which is totally true. Without U.S. investment propping up the Chinese regime, the regime would not have the power and technology to be so powerful and authoritarian. Sullivan said something similar while speaking at the Lowy Institute in 2017. He made it clear he is all for China's rise.
We need to strike a middle course, one that encourages China's rise in a manner consistent with an open, fair, rules-based regional order. Right now is the time we should be doubling down on our allies, making our alliances more dynamic to face the threats and challenges of the 21st century. And let me be clear, that's not about containing China. It's about reinforcing the very foundation of regional stability that has, among other things, facilitated China's remarkable rise. So I think that the Europeans do have to think very hard about taking a larger role in a project that the United States has been engaged in for some time, which is doing everything we can to both facilitate and encourage China's economic rise and to support it. Because a thriving China is good for Europe, it's good for the United States, it's good for Asia.
Yes, it's been so good for everyone. The fundamental problem with this is that Sullivan is conflating China and the Chinese Communist Party. Talking about the rise of China is not like talking about the rise of a free country, like Canada. The rise of China means more money for many Chinese people, sure, but it also means the strengthening of a totalitarian regime that puts dissidents in labor camps and harvests their organs. Not to mention one that has an aggressive strategy to undermine democracy and freedom worldwide. I'd much rather see the rise of Canada, where they apologize to their minorities for historical abuses, and the worst human rights abuse is poutine. Then there's Kurt Campbell, another Biden advisor. Campbell was the Assistant Secretary of State during the Obama administration. I bring him up next because he and Sullivan penned this piece in Foreign Affairs. They criticized the concept of strategic competition with China. What exactly is the United States competing for? And what might a plausible desired outcome of this competition look like? A failure to connect competitive means to clear ends will allow U.S. policy to drift toward competition for competition's sake, and then fall into a dangerous cycle of confrontation. Well, in my view, it's actually pretty clear what the competition is about. Things like China's military-led intellectual property theft that helps Chinese companies outcompete U.S. innovators, or the Chinese Communist Party's financial backing of Iran and North Korea, which both threaten the U.S. And then there's the deeper competition, the competition of values, whether people want to be led by a government that respects its citizens' rights and freedoms, or an abusive government that demands absolute obedience to its leaders. And the desired outcomes for the U.S. are that China stops stealing from U.S. citizens and companies, stops backing our geopolitical enemies, and stops abusing its own people. Just my opinion, though. Now, to be fair, Campbell and Sullivan do criticize China's human rights issues and its fusion of mass surveillance and artificial intelligence, enabling a more effective digital authoritarianism. But they neglect to point out how China's digital authoritarianism was built and supported by U.S. tech companies following the mantra of engagement. But that's fine, because the U.S. needs China. As a global economic actor, China is central to the prosperity of American allies and partners. Its students and tourists flow through global universities and cities. Its factories are the forge for much of the world's advanced technology. They also seem strangely resigned to China's military rivaling or surpassing the U.S. The United States must accept that military primacy will be difficult to restore, given the reach of China's weapons. And you know how Secretary of State Mike Pompeo has shown tremendous support for our ally Taiwan, even clearly saying it's not a part of China? Don't expect that policy to continue. Sullivan and Campbell write, on Taiwan, a tacit commitment not to unilaterally alter the status quo is perhaps the best that can be hoped for, given the historical complexities involved. I wonder what happens when the status quo is altered by a Chinese invasion of Taiwan, which, by the way, the Chinese leadership is telling us they are going to do. Sullivan and Campbell then basically say the real way to deal with China is through the same multilateral alliances and the international institutions we were using under the Bush and Obama administrations, like our alliances with Europe and the World Trade Organization. Now sure, that strategy wasn't successful in the past, but maybe this time it'll be different for some reason. Campbell has vastly miscalculated on China before. He was involved in the Scarborough Shoal incident back in 2012. China's Coast Guard invaded the Scarborough Shoal, disputed territory in the South China Sea, claimed by China and the Philippines. Campbell led a team of diplomats that worked out a deal where both Chinese and Filipino forces agreed to withdraw. Except the U.S. screwed it up, because while the Philippines kept its end of the deal, China never left. And Chinese ships still occupy the Scarborough Shoal to this day. I'll be back with more on Biden's potential advisors after the break. Welcome back. Let's talk more about Joe Biden's potential advisors and how they might influence U.S.-China policy, like Janet Yellen. Yellen is Biden's pick for Treasury Secretary. She's also the former chair of the Federal Reserve. As Treasury Secretary, she would have a big influence on trade. Yellen has been a vocal critic of the trade war. And by the trade war, Yellen means Trump's trade war, whereas the Trump administration sees it as the U.S. response to the pre-existing trade war that China launched on the U.S. decades ago. Yellen has also expressed concerns about the U.S. decoupling from the Chinese economy. As Treasury Secretary, Yellen would also lead the Committee on Foreign Investment in the United States, CFIUS, which looks at whether investment deals pose a threat to national security. And there's a real possibility that she would roll back the ban on Chinese telecom Huawei despite security concerns. Earlier this year, she spoke at the Asian Financial Forum in Hong Kong. She said, technologies developed in one place of the world need to be and can be applied throughout the world and become the base for further progress of technological innovation. And it's true. If the Chinese regime can't continue to steal and reverse engineer foreign technology, how will the Communist Party make further technological innovation? Now let's look at Susan Rice. Rice was Obama's national security advisor, and she's been pushing to become Biden's Secretary of State or Defense. Secretary of Defense is a position Biden still hasn't announced, so she might still be in the running. And like Biden, she follows the Henry Kissinger school of thought on China, engagement. Here's Biden's foreign policy advisor, Ely Ratner. Ratner was one of Vice President Biden's deputy national security advisors from 2015 to 2017. He's been saying the U.S. must forget America first to counter China. Basically, that's the Biden campaign's talking point about working with allies in Europe to counter China. But what happens when those allies are also badly infiltrated by the CCP, like Germany? Then how is working with allies going to accomplish anything but watering down U.S. policy? The Trump administration has instead focused on bilateral alliances to counter China. U.S.-India, U.S.-Japan, U.S.-Taiwan. It basically cuts down on the chances China can undermine the relationship. But in multilateral coalitions, China has proven to be very successful at throwing a monkey wrench in the works. Like how Chinese investment in Greece got the country to block an EU statement on human rights in China. But you know what? According to Ratner, China isn't even to blame. In August, he said the China challenge right now is about us. It's not about them. It's about our own competitiveness. He's right. The U.S. is being totally unfair, not wanting the Communist Party to undermine American society. That is so competitive. And finally, I want to point out one more area of concern: the influence of academia and think tanks. This is a recent letter from the Asia Society. The Asia Society is basically an educational/lobbying group that, among other things, partners with the Communist Party-funded Confucius Institutes around the country. This letter is a doozy. It basically calls for U.S.-China collaboration on fighting the coronavirus and developing a vaccine. It argues the U.S. should share scientific data, medical practices, efforts to step up production and distribution of medical supplies, and clinical trials for vaccine and treatment research, testing, production, and distribution. It also says the U.S. can rely on China to make the protective gear and medicines needed to fight the virus. I mean, sure, China covered up the coronavirus so the CCP could hoard medical supplies, but moving forward, I'm sure the U.S. can totally rely on the CCP. What kind of people would sign this letter? Well, Jake Sullivan, Kurt Campbell, Susan Rice, Ely Ratner, as well as Biden's pick for Secretary of State, Antony Blinken, Biden's pick for Director of National Intelligence, Avril Haines, and Obama's China Ambassador, Max Baucus. I bring him up because he said U.S.-China relations will reset if Biden wins the election. Now, all that being said, we don't know for sure what Biden would actually do as president when it comes to China. But when all his top advisors say, go soft and cooperate, it would take a very strong will to go in a different direction. And now, it's a time when I answer a question from you, the fans who support China Uncensored on the crowdfunding website Patreon. We couldn't afford to keep making this show without your support. Today's question comes from Jenny Wong. Hi, Chris, Shelley, and Matt. Would you talk about the debt crisis of state enterprises in China? Great question, Jenny. That probably deserves a whole episode. But just briefly, there have been some major developments just this month. Several of China's state-owned enterprises have defaulted on their loans this year. For example, Tsinghua Unigroup, a state-run semiconductor company, defaulted on a $200 million bond. A major state-owned mining company also defaulted on $150 million of debt. Again, this is a topic that really deserves a full episode, but the important thing to remember is that the Chinese Communist Party is not stable. It's poorly run and horribly corrupt. The only reason it seems so powerful is effective propaganda and investment from the West. So while people like Jake Sullivan and Kurt Campbell may argue that the U.S. has just got to get used to the CCP's rise, the reality is it's not stable without foreign investment and could collapse without it. Thanks for your question, Jenny. And thank you, as always, for watching. We are in an information war with the Chinese Communist Party, and knowledge is the best weapon. YouTube has been hitting us with demonetization a lot again, so help us in our fight to bring truthful, uncensored information about China to the world. Join the China Uncensored 50-cent army on Patreon, and for as little as $1 an episode, you can help us keep up the fight. And you'll be able to ask me questions I might answer on the show. Visit patreon.com/China Uncensored to join. Once again, I'm Chris Chappell. See you next time.